As a result of Reconstruction, obviously the South feels that they've lost all control because every part of their existence has been ripped away. They've lost control of their local governments. They've lost control of their state governments. Former Confederates are scrambling to try to make ends meet. And some thought that there would be maybe genteel acceptance for the loss of the war and the freedom of African Americans, but that's obviously not going to be the case. So, as a result of that, an American terrorist organization by the name of the Ku Klux Klan rises up during this era, mostly made up of former Confederates, and a number of others like the Bushwhackers and Partisans and Home Guard along the border states. The group's intent, the Invisible Empire's intent, is to limit the rights of African Americans who have gained freedom. So, opportunity to get jobs, register to vote, show up to the ballot box, and this is where the process of like burning homes, burning crosses, lynchings during this period of time. Do keep in mind a lynching, the way we think of it is like someone being hanged, but really what a lynching is a execution without a trial. So these types of tactics were taking place. The first leader and grand wizard of the the original Klan starts in Tennessee, which is a little ironic because that's the first state that re-enters the Union after the war, and that is going to be Nathan Bedford Forrest. But as Burns alluded to, Forrest doesn't, he actually gets out of the organization. Really, they resort to such deadly violence and terror throughout the American South that Ulysses S. Grant, when he's president, he and Congress initiated what is called the Third Force Act. It's also known as the Anti-Ku Klux Klan Bill. And this particular bill allowed for martial law. Well, if you look at the date, that all kind of makes sense because there's obviously military occupation in the South, and that's a way to sort of bring down the Klan. This is, I wouldn't say overwhelmingly successful, but it does the job over time. The Klan ultimately falls apart by the end of Reconstruction, but the theory and ideology and the foundation platform of the Klan is there, it exists, and it's going to resurrect. So in the early 1900s at Stone Mountain, Georgia, we see like the resurgence of a second Klan led by a guy named William J. Simmons, who brought the Klan back atop Stone Mountain, Georgia. And then we see it decline again. Really what leads to the collapse of the second Klan is going to be a lot of financial problems, corruption within, but the real dagger or nail in the coffin, however you want to put it, for the second Klan is really World War II because so many people mobilized for war and there's no leadership, there's no real membership. And then tragically, in the post-World War II era, we have a resurgence of a third Klan, and it's still around today, and it still has leaders like David Duke who run for president and are still touting that racist rhetoric. Yeah, Andrew.
Was the second Klan, you said the Klan in World War II, was it like a Nazi, were they Nazi sympathizers?
No, actually there's a really interesting book, and I'll have to I'll get you guys the author because this might be a good topic for you guys to take a look at, but like moving into next semester, the fact that the real like sort of like neo-Nazi movement really wasn't adopted by that post-World War II generation, because that group fought in Europe, right? It's actually going to be adopted more by the neo-Nazi movement's more adopted by like the Boomer generation, Generation X, and sadly like handed down to your generation, which is kind of like a weird disconnect. Like there's another guy too. I feel really bad. I can't remember this guy's name. He also just came out with a book. I'll have to get the one's a historian, and this guy, he was brought into the neo-Nazi movement, and what he blames like sort of the rise of that movement on is the lack of education and understanding that young people they lacked about the rise of Nazi Germany and World War II, right? Like I feel like we I mean, obviously we were together last year, and a lot of you guys were with other U.S. history instructors. I feel pretty certain you got well in depth with World War II and the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany, and how we can make that make those connections of like your great grandparents and my grandparents fought to prevent these people from potentially invading our shores and trying to conquer our nation. Right?
That kind of makes me think of remember during the Charlottesville riots, there's that one famous person who was just like screaming. They actually interviewed him. He had like some crazy long Polish name, and I was thinking, according to Nazi racial ideology, the Poles were used as racially inferior to the Nords and Norwegian, to the Nordic race, as they called it, and the Germanic people. And so it's like even they're not educated, like Polish neo-Nazi, that would be unthinkable in like not actual Nazi Germany, because they would be as intervention.
Yeah, so, you bring up a really good parallel to this era as well, because it's a lot of the people that get into this movement are a lot of poor white individuals who would have had a whole lot more to gain by trying to work with African American communities and they themselves trying to move forward and become educated, but instead it becomes a race war instead of an opportunity to actually rebuild and move forward in the American South. And that is why I find it very important to bring up that Virginia through the readjusters that were led by Billy Mahone and a number of other prominent Virginians who were saying, really, the only way for us to move forward is to truly rebuild, and by rebuilding, it doesn't mean laying down a railroad track and building bridges. It means we've got to move away from the mentality that African Americans are inferior. They too need an education, but the readjusters were also really dialed in on providing opportunities and education for poor whites, and that's a theme that Reconstruction also, a legacy rather, that Reconstruction creates, is that poor white communities suffer for generations just as poor African American communities. Do those poor whites have more civil rights? Of course. But the lack of dignity, the lack of opportunity, they share that common bond. And it's a bond that if they would have figured that, if that could have been figured out earlier, we may not have the racial tension. We are getting past these problems now because we are the first generations with true equality and freedom. And I know we could argue all right, in reality, is everybody equal? Does everybody have equal opportunity? Obviously there are limitations, but this is an unprecedented time where there is equality. And the reason that we study this is it's an opportunity to move forward in a positive way. You know what I mean? So we don't make these mistakes again. Yeah.
I have a funny story going back to the Ku Klux Klan. My dad met David Duke.
Really?
Mm-hmm. He was campaigning in Louisiana, and he tried to recruit my dad.
I'm not surprised.
And then my dad was like, "I'm Catholic, no."
That's where that's like their base, like where, and again, like Robin brings up a good point. That second and third Ku Klux Klan is what you would consider, and I know this sounds weird, and you've heard me say this before. They're like a more equal opportunity hate group in the second and third wave, because they're not just anti-African American in the 20th century. They are anti-Catholic, they're anti-Semitic, which runs Andrew's parallel. They're anti-immigrant. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on, and then it creates a larger web of contradiction. And that's, and I will stop it here. That's exactly a great point that Andrew brought up. The contradiction of Charlottesville, right? People that are behind this cause that would have been the very people that would have been targeted and subjugated by the root of their cause. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
My thought was, this is something new to the city. Our state vote is but it seems like a real bad thing to run across down there.
Yeah.
But apparently they do it because it's from a movie, and that movie took it from the Scottish Declaration of War in 1745.
You're right. So Michelle brought up a good point here. The cross burning tradition comes from Scotland, but it also becomes popularized by the first full-length feature film called Birth of a Nation. It's insanely racist. It was done by D.W. Griffith. And if you sat down for it and watched it, there would be some red flags that jumped out. You're like, wow, this is crazy. There are people acting in this film in blackface. And there are obviously a lot of like very sort of like there's racist rhetoric throughout, but I don't think you all would be offended. You know what I mean? It's a silent film. But had you knowing what you know and having taken this class and obviously your prior knowledge, you would be able to put the pieces together that this film really became a big piece of propaganda for the rise of the Second Klan, as like sort of justifying the Civil War as the lost cause. So you guys can check it out. Birth of a Nation, not the new one. Ironically enough, the new Birth of a Nation, which I would highly recommend, is about the Nat Turner slave rebellion, which was done by Nate Parker, who is a native down in Norfolk. I encourage you to take a look at both of them. Nate Parker purposely named this film, Birth of a Nation, as like the rewrite of the Birth of a Nation. If that makes sense. So, The Invisible Empire. This is another Thomas Nast cartoon of the Klan in league with the White League to try to intimidate and scare the African American families who had gained their freedom. Another Reconstruction piece of policy that is really important is the purchase of Alaska for $7.2 million. So it's kind of important to understand that globally through the establishment of sort of America as a reunified nation, but also as still a global power, because the Civil War, that is the sort of catalyst for America booming in the Second Industrial Revolution. Well, this purchase of Alaska, which everybody believed was a complete mistake and a huge joke, they called it Seward's Folly, this purchase of Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million is like right there with the Louisiana Purchase in terms of resources and sort of fueling America to be the #1 world power, rather than ranked in the top 10, moving into the American Civil War. It's a massive land claim for oil, gold, timber, fishing rights, shipping rights, and it's really a huge bargain. This is kind of some funny Seward cartoons. So this all goes down when Andrew Johnson was still president. So here we have Old Mother Seward rubbing the Russian salve on the head of the president. Here we have Seward pulling Russian America and the treaty to gain Alaska, and then that's William Seward, Secretary of State under Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. So the Grant administration comes in. Grant's going to win handily in 2 elections. In his first election in 1868, he defeats Horatio Seymour, and in the election of 1872, he defeats Horace Greeley. So 2 terms as president. He tries to run his office sort of like a general. So he puts a lot of cronies and generals in charge. It's kind of a little bit of a spoil system type thing. But again, it's very difficult to find. If you look at every presidential administration, there's very few where a president says, "Oh, hey, I'm going to keep the same people in that are my opposition." No, presidents are going to put their own people in charge. Well, this creates sort of the similar thing that Andrew Jackson dealt with, but even on a worse level, because there's this widespread corruption. And the level of corruption is magnified due to the fact that America has come out of the Civil War, the Union has won the Civil War, and there is a great deal of wealth in the North, and there's a great demand for trade and globalization and a move toward imperialism during this era. So all the things that Grant kind of gets done, like he sort of settles our differences with Britain that had been fractured during the war. He's going to pass the Anti-Ku Klux Klan Act. He establishes the Treaty of Washington. He establishes Yellowstone National Park, which I'm very appreciative of personally. All of that is completely overshadowed by a number of major scandals. And they would, even in today's world, where I feel like we live in a pretty scandalous era, if you think about it politically, these would still rank as some of the worst political scandals in American history. I don't know if you're familiar with them. I think some of you are. Black Friday. This is where Jay Gould and Jim Fisk tried to corner the entire gold market, that if Grant wouldn't have stepped in, Grant had no idea, it would have bankrupted the country. The whiskey ring. The whiskey ring was a excise tax that had been placed on alcohol, and some of Grant's cronies, including some of Grant's family members, were a part of it, and they were collecting. Hey, what's up, man? They were collecting graft and kickbacks along the way. You also have the most notable scandal of the 3, and that is what is known as credit mobilier. Credit mobilier is essentially like a real big sort of railroad corruption case gone wrong. The Credit Mobilier Company was a shovel company, and they agreed to do work for the federal government on the Transcontinental Railroad, and the estimated total for business was going to be like $10 or $11 million, something like that. It might have been as high as 12, but the real cost of that was more like somewhere around 4 or 6 million. These are the issues that government was tied into during the war, but also after the war, and that kind of fell in Grant's lap. So Grant just kind of looked like he was a guy that didn't know what was going on. He was surrounded by a bunch of corrupt cronies, and it's kind of weird because if you think about it, Grant is not one of these people that really sought political office or sought that sort of arena. He's kind of like, when you think about Grant and Eisenhower and some of these other generals that become president, it's almost like office sought them. It's kind of a sad end to his public service because he's just seen as a president that was controlled by party politics, sort of a puppet to the corrupt folks around him, and again, it overshadows all the good that he did in office. So here we have Grant, 18th President of the United States. This is a political cartoon from one of the great satirical magazines of the era. If you've been with me in the past, you've seen some of these cartoons. It's from a magazine called Puck. It's a political cartoon, it's a political magazine, and they did a lot of satirical political cartoons during the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction era. So where's Lee at the end of the war? Lee does not run for political office. He goes on to take a job at Washington College in Lexington, Virginia. He'll live out the rest of his days there. That was locked. Sorry. They renamed the college Washington and Lee University. If you ever have any burning desire to go through any of Lee's letters, the majority of his private collection is in their special collections. It's kind of cool for people that are sort of into the primary research. So Washington and Lee and the Virginia Military Institute are side by side. Really, there's nothing that separates them. You walk from one campus and on to the other. All of Lee's papers are at Washington and Lee in their archives, and Jackson's papers are in VMI's archives, and they're about maybe 150 yards from each other. So Lee sticks around, serves as president of the college. I don't know, has anybody ever visited Washington and Lee? You guys should check it out. It's a beautiful campus. This is Lee Chapel. Lee and his family are buried in the mausoleum beneath the chapel across from his office. Outside is Lee's warhorse. Traveler is buried outside the chapel. And then if you just go down the sidewalk here, you will arrive at my alma mater. If you go down the sidewalk the other way, you'll come across a statue of Cyrus McCormick, inventor of the Reaper. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Frederick Douglass. Where's Frederick Douglass at the end of the war? Well, a big part of the post-Civil War era, as a result of the Grant administration, is people fighting against patronage or nepotism, because they felt like that had cost the country millions, and localities Reconstruction was a drain on resources. So through Reconstruction and in the post-Reconstruction era, civil service and the hiring of civil servants based on merit became a big-time crusade. And Frederick Douglass was one of the crusaders for civil service reform. What Frederick Douglass wanted to see done was African Americans gain the opportunity to get civil service jobs, because certainly if there was nepotism, patronage type system, African Americans would not be capable of getting those jobs. So he becomes a crusader for civil service. He also becomes the first African American to become a foreign ambassador. He becomes ambassador to Haiti, which is fitting because Haiti was a country of former slaves that rose up against France. So here we have Frederick Douglass as ambassador to Haiti. And then the election of 1876, this is sort of one of the most controversial elections in American history, ranked in the top 5. Squaring off between Samuel Tilden of New York, who took down the Boss Tweed Ring, and Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, who had been a general in the Civil War. Some refer to this as the last battle of the Civil War because it truly does bring about an end to Reconstruction. The popular and the electoral vote were not as close as they've ever been, but they were pretty close. So rather than this being determined by Congress, as it should have been, it was determined by a group of sort of like hand-picked justices and congressmen in a bit of a backroom deal. So the way this election ends is Hayes becomes president, the Republicans retain the White House, and the South regains control of their local and state governments, and military occupation ends. This becomes known as the Compromise of 1877. But people see the Compromise of 1877, and historians sort of see it as another corrupt bargain, because Tilden's out, Hayes is in, the South regains control of these governments, and so begin the passage of sweeping Jim Crow laws at the local and state level. This is where we start referring to the South as the Solid South, and we start referring to the Southern Democrats as the Dixiecrats. This is also an era known as the Redeemer Movement, meaning that it's a group of people trying to go back to the status quo. They want to regain control. And this is a really, I think, this is one of the most chilling statistics of Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. Through Reconstruction, over 300 African Americans had been elected to public office, local, state, federal. Within 3 years of the end of Reconstruction, 1880, there are only 3 elected African Americans left. All right? By 1900, that number is 0. During Reconstruction, there was a number of carpetbaggers that had gained office, and as a result of the Redeemer Movement, those carpetbaggers were either run out of office, or in some cases they themselves either disappeared or were lynched. So it's not just African Americans that are going to be victims of the Redeemer Movement. And then this is something to kind of wrap your head around. When you think about sort of, let me show you this real quick before we, hold on. I want to show you this cartoon. This is a Redeemer cartoon. On the left, we have an Irishman. In the middle there, we have a former Confederate. On the right, we have a railroad magnate. And on the bottom, trampled upon him, well, he could be a politician on the right too, is the African-American freedman. And what is he reaching out for that he can't grip? He's got an American flag in his hand, but he can't reach what? Just out of distance. Another Thomas Nast cartoon. No, that's a good guess. What's this right here? Does anybody know what that is? It doesn't look like that anymore for us. You all will be able to take part in this in the next year or two.
Ballot?
Yeah, it's a voting. It's a ballot box. He's trying to reach for the right to vote, but loses it through Jim Crow. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, they're depicted like ape-like, usually with whiskey in hand during that era. So women's suffrage continues, led by the old guard, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Carrie Nation. But a new group of women emerge, women like Carrie Catt, Amelia Bloomer. A young woman also come on the scene that a lot of people don't associate with the suffrage movement, but is tremendously important, will be Helen Keller. And the crusade for women's right to vote will not be obtained until after World War II with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Do keep in mind that Susan B. Anthony was arrested in Rochester for voting for Ulysses S. Grant. And she also will found the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1890. Tragically, these women will not see the opportunity to vote. So this is what I wanted you all to keep in mind. The legacy and the heritage of Reconstruction is one that's complex. Many Southerners regard Reconstruction as worse than the war itself. They resented the upending of their social and racial system. The Republicans had good intentions, but they really failed to improve the South, and the fate of African Americans remained poor until really the 1970s, 80s. Really, this is still a legacy that we're living with, right? African Americans aren't receiving true equal rights until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64, Voting Rights Act of '65, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. So that is a long-lasting, problematic legacy. The legacy of the New South, a bit of a backward social ideology, prevented equality through the passage of segregation laws, better known as Jim Crow, and this is something that we are still working to get through socially today. And it has to be addressed, bottom line. Many historians will point to this moment as the beginning of the lost cause idea. I would disagree. I would say the beginning of the lost cause is probably 1863. But the continuation of the lost cause, I would wholeheartely agree, begins here. And this is the...
1863.
Yep.
Why only 1865?
I think that following Gettysburg and Vicksburg, that's the true beginning of the lost cause. I mean, they weren't going to be able to get... I mean, you could make an argument for 65. But the war dragged on, the death toll continued to rise, and no foreign nation was eager to accept the Confederate States as a sovereign nation. You know what I mean? So in my opinion, that's, the summer of '63 is the downward spiral, right? So I would say that I can get on board with the historian saying that this is the beginning of the continuation of the lost cause. This is the beginning of Monument Avenue, and that legacy is one that we've got to navigate together. I mean, we have to figure out, like, how do we tell this history and tell it truthfully, right? I think that this is I think every American should understand this war from start to finish. And that's why I wanted to take the opportunity to get through Reconstruction with you guys. So, are there any questions or comments? Anybody else?
All right.